Hi, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we take a more in-depth look at music, movies, art, and culture. And this time, we're going to be talking about Sara Bareilles' new hit album, The Blessed Unrest. The year was 2007, and Billboard's Hot 100 chart was surging in a wave of hits. The pop rock boom in the mid-2000s was at its peak. Justin Timberlake had just released his smash album, Future Sex Love Sounds, and with collaborators Nelly Furtado and Timbaland, had taken the charts by storm. Combined with the creative resurgence of Gwen Stefani, the peak of Fergie's, Akon's, and Avril Lavigne's careers, Kanye West's well-publicized rivalry with 50 Cent, and the arrival of soon-to-be megastar Rihanna, it was a year full of monster hits that remain surprisingly solid to this day. Sure, there was a fair amount of junk, mostly courtesy of Nickelback and the post-grunge movement that just wouldn't goddamn die. But the hits of this year aren't just good, they can probably be considered some of the definitive tracks of the decade. And what's all the more impressive is that so many acts reached creative high points in 2007, most of which would carry over into the slightly weaker, but still pretty damn good 2008. And it's not just that these songs were good, because a lot of them weren't. They stuck in the cultural consciousness, and most remain just as well remembered 6 years later. This is the year of Carrie Underwood's Smash Through with Before He Cheats. Maroon 5 release Makes Me Wonder. Beyonce dropped Irreplaceable. The Fray put out How to Save a Life. Snow Patrol charted with Chasing Cars. And even Amy Winehouse broke through with her signature hit Rehab. Hell, even the one-hit wonders of the time like Hey There Delilah by the Plain White T's managed to lodge its way into our minds and bury themselves in the cultural unconscious. Even if you weren't paying any attention to the radio in 2007, I can guarantee that most of you recognize the songs I just listed. And frankly, I didn't even touch half of the songs that charted and made a major impact in this year. But it's also in 2007 that a newly signed singer-songwriter named Sara Bareilles was asked to finish off her major label debut with a love song. But the songwriting process was going nowhere, and in a fit of rage, she wrote one of the defining hits of the decade, a song blasting her label in a fit of angry guitar and pounding piano. And while it wouldn't seriously impact the charts until 2008, Sara Bareilles' love song is a staple of the decade and a goddamn masterpiece of pop music. I'm not kidding here either. Every element of this song works incredibly well. The sharp edges of the lyrics, the pounding instrumentals that speak to raw frustration, the sheer passion in Bareilles' vocals. And it all comes together into a song that speaks to creative frustration and the drive for independence. And speaking as a content creator, I can definitely get behind that sentiment. And thus I had reasonably high expectations when I went through Sara Bareilles' major label releases before The Blessed Unrest, and the underlying hope that Love Song wasn't just a flash in the pan. And for once things turned out well, with both of her albums being very solid, very well written pop rock that sticks in the memory. Described by some critics as a blend between Alicia Keys and Regina Spektor, Sara Bareilles manages to combine the best elements of both artists, despite them being in a genre for which I typically have a certain distaste. The white chick with piano genre. Now, I'll admit my opinions have evolved somewhat since I reviewed What We Saw from the Cheap Seats by Regina Spektor last year, and while I'm still not a fan of the genre, I think I've finally been able to pinpoint why. Without exception, particularly in the weaker areas of the genre, there's very little diversity when it comes to subject matter and execution. Now, I realize there are exceptions, and I also realize that I'm definitely not the target audience for Sara Bareilles and her contemporaries' work, but I also can't help but notice that the genre often fails to stretch itself both in the material and in the delivery, which can lead to a certain smug self-satisfaction dominating tracks of the songs. It's not just that they feel interchangeable and occasionally really boring, but that there's no deeper passion underlying their work. And if there is that deeper passion, it just doesn't feel authentic. And when some of the artists do try to stretch that subject material, they come across as so insufferably pleased with themselves for doing so that it just becomes intolerable. So what makes Sara Bareilles stand out against the crowd? Well, unlike her contemporaries, she often seems to be trying, incorporating a greater vocal presence and more passionate soul into her delivery. Yeah, I'll admit that most of the time the subject matter in which she sings about is still rather small and reasonably simple, but she sells it, and it feels real. And in comparison to Alicia Keys, Sara Bareilles is smart enough to delve into a greater spread of subject matter and instrumentation other than just underwritten piano-driven ballads. It definitely helps that Sara Bareilles has a real knack for punchy, sly little rhymes that show some real clever construction how they're put together. No, it's not quite as organic as Casey Musgraves, but it's close. So what do I think about her newest album, The Blessed Unrest? Well, it definitely isn't bad. And a lot of the good things described about the album, as I mentioned earlier, are all still true. Unfortunately, it's also Sara Bareilles' weakest and most inconsistent album to date, and the problems that might have been lurking on the edges on previous albums are now in plain sight. Look, it's by no means bad. Hell, by the standards of this year, I'd actually argue it's pretty damn good. But I can't help but feel that Sara Bareilles might be joining the Strokes, Avril Lavigne, and Armin van Buuren in the list of acts that very much peaked with their first album. So let's start with production. Sara Bareilles has always had a reputation of writing very solid pop melodies that fit into the modern pop landscape almost suspiciously well. But a problem I spotted on her previous album, Kaleidoscope Heart, was the use of production to make the sound more expansive instead of relying on instrumental intensity or energy, which to me strikes as the precisely wrong direction. In fact, it kind of reminded me of All That Echoes, the album by Josh Groban I reviewed earlier this year, where the production was being used to make the song sound more epic and expansive instead of relying on the vocalist. Now, I understand you have to do this in some cases. On, let's say, artists like Britney Spears, her voice is so weak that she requires multi-tracking and overdubbing in order for her songs to sound remotely big. But here's the thing. Like Josh Groban, Sara Bareilles doesn't need this. She has a powerful voice with an impressive range, and on the better tracks of Blessed Unrest, we actually see that. But it also sounds like someone in the studio told her to tone it down a bit and let the production take over. And look, while the production is good and modern, it does reflect a loss of musical personality that just feels wrong. And coupled with a more muted and subdued instrumentation overall, with little of the clattering energy of her first two albums, it really begins to render some of her material rather bland. And here's where we have to talk about the songwriting. Look, as I've said, Sara Bareilles typically writes smaller, more intimate songs, with topics that can carry a lot of emotional weight, but aren't exactly ones that are meant to be addressed to anybody outside of a smaller audience. Even her louder songs tend to have a tighter focus, not so much introspective or self-obsessed, but private and personal. They've got a tighter scope. And while these songs don't tend to be my thing, I can definitely recognize quality when I see it, and Sara Bareilles manages to nail the balance here exceptionally well. So I don't know whose utterly imbecilic idea it was that she lead off the album with an overblown, crowd-pleasing anthem in Brave. It doesn't nearly work as well as it should. Sure, it's not a bad song, but it's definitely a weaker entry in Bareilles' singles, and it just doesn't measure up when compared to Love Song or King of Anything. What it is unfortunately indicative of is a marked decrease in the songwriting quality on the rest of the album, which just feels distinctly less sharp in comparison with its predecessors. Sure, there's still poetry, but none of it feels as cutting or as sly. And without that edge, her album just gets a lot less interesting. The best songs turn out to be Chasing the Sun and Manhattan, both songs that use well-developed metaphors with regards to New York to explore certain situations. And for each of these songs, it seems that we get a few tedious love songs that just don't have enough personality or energy to be interesting. Sure, they contain some pretty clever wordplay, but nothing that's all that interesting or special. And the fact that Bareilles sounds a lot less invested in these songs certainly doesn't help matters. But then I asked myself the question, well, is that part of the point? After all, the title of the album is The Blessed Unrest. So could Bareilles be making the point that she derives more of her artistic passion from the turbulence in her relationship rather than the contentment, that she relishes the conflict over the peace? It certainly would make sense with regards to the rest of her material, where it was always seemed like her best material was rooted in conflict and angry passion. So with that in mind, could Bareilles be making a metatextual point, with the stronger material on her album being the songs about turbulent or broken relationships? Now that's an interesting hypothesis to be sure, but then I remembered another fact. Even though the slower, more content material might not be to my taste, and even though I can acknowledge it's still reasonably well written, as I said, I can recognize quality when I hear it. And to be blunt, songs like I Choose You and Cassiopeia and Hercules on the Blessed Unrest just aren't very good and can't match the quality of the rest of the album. I might not fit within the demographic sweet spot for these sort of songs, I realize that, but I can acknowledge when it's done right, and despite the pretty writing and occasionally clever turn of phrase, there's just a shallow emptiness to this material that just isn't very strong, ironic statement or otherwise. So in summary, while I don't precisely think The Blessed Unrest is bad, there's still enough good writing, good singing, and solid themes to keep it from the slush pile. It's definitely the weakest of Sara Bareilles' discography thus far. To me, it feels as if Sara Bareilles is starting to adopt some of the worst traits of her genre, particularly in the shallower songwriting. And while it's still far smarter and emotionally grounded from most of the genre, I can't help but feel that it's something of a step backwards. If you're a fan of hers, you'll probably still like it. But otherwise, take my recommendation with a very strong asterisk. And hey, at least it'll be better than that other album coming out today. Yeah, that's coming. God damn it, Chris Brown. Thanks so much for watching. As I'd like you to please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.